A young boy named Rami clings to a flickering lantern, the only connection to his sister Layla after their torn apart escaping war. Battling storms, ruthless traffickers, and the unforgiving sea, Rami's determination leads him to an old fisherman with a haunted past. Together they face impossible odds in a dangerous bid to reunite with Layla. But as sacrifices mount and darkness closes in, Rami must answer a question that could shatter him. How far will he go to keep the light of hope alive? The storm raged as if the heavens themselves were tearing apart, hurling rain and furious winds over the fragile boat. Rami clutched the flickering lantern close to his chest, his small fingers trembling as icy droplets stung his face. Around him, cries of fear and desperation rose into the storm, a cacophony of voices pleading for safety. The overcrowded boat groaned and tilted under the weight of too many souls, bobbing on the Mediterranean like a leaf in a torrent. "Stay close!" a woman's voice had shouted before the chaos began. Layla's voice. It echoed in Rami's mind now, urging him to remember her words. "Follow the light, and you'll find me." But Layla was gone. He'd last seen her when the smugglers had shouted, forcing her into another group as they fled their crumbling village. Her hand had slipped from his, but before she disappeared into the crowd, she pressed the lantern into his hands. A sudden jolt knocked Rami to the side, his heart seizing as the boat tipped precariously. The lantern's fragile glow wavered, casting fleeting shadows over terrified faces. Then came the sound, a deep, sickening crack. Panic erupted as water surged through the splintering hull. "They're sinking us!" someone screamed. People surged toward the edges, scrambling to leap into the black abyss of the sea. The boat shuddered again, tilting sharply. Rami gasped as the lantern slipped from his hands, its light tumbling overboard. "No!" He lunged, fingers brushing its edge before it vanished beneath the churning waves. Without thinking, he dove after it. The water hit him like shards of ice, stealing the air from his lungs. The lantern's faint glow bobbed just ahead of him, growing dimmer with each second. Rami kicked with all his might, his thin legs churning against the pull of the sea. Finally, his fingers closed around the cold metal frame. He clutched it to his chest as the waves tossed him mercilessly, dragging him further and further from the wreckage. His heart pounded with a wild rhythm, a blend of terror and determination. Layla told me to follow the light. I have to keep it. When the storm finally released him, dawn broke sluggishly, casting a pale gray light over a barren shoreline. Rami's small body lay crumpled on the rocks, his arms still wrapped around the broken lantern. The island was desolate, its cliffs jagged and unwelcoming. Waves roared against the rocks, their relentless crash echoing in the stillness. The sky was a murky canvas of gray, the sun's warmth hidden behind stubborn clouds. Rami stumbled to his feet, shivering violently. His clothes clung to his skin, heavy and cold. He turned the lantern over in his hands. Its glass shattered, the tiny flame extinguished. A deep pang of despair welled in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He had no time for despair. Layla was waiting. The boy's feet carried him inland, his steps faltering on the uneven terrain. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a dull ache that grew sharper with each passing hour. But he pressed on, his resolve stronger than his fear. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the island, Rami spotted smoke curling in the distance. His heart leapt. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. He broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The source of the smoke was a crumbling stone hut perched on the edge of a cliff. Inside, an old man hunched over a flickering fire, his face lined with age and grief. "Who's there?" the man barked, his voice sharp as he turned toward the doorway. I need help," Rami stammered, stepping inside. The warmth of the fire wrapped around him, a fleeting comfort. The man's eyes narrowed as he took in the boy's soaked clothes and trembling frame. "You shouldn't be here. Go back to where you came from." "I don't have anywhere to go," Rami said, clutching the lantern tighter. "I'm looking for my sister. She's waiting for me." The man let out a bitter laugh. "The sea doesn't wait for anyone, boy. It takes and it never gives back." Rami didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the fire. He couldn't afford to believe the man's words. Layla was out there. She had to be. The old man, Elias, eventually let Rami stay, though he made it clear he didn't want company. "You eat what you find," he muttered, handing Rami a small piece of bread. That night, as the wind howled outside, Rami sat by the fire, repairing the lantern with careful hand. Elias watched in silence, his gruff exterior hiding a flicker of curiosity. "What's so special about that lantern?" he finally asked. "It's not just a lantern," Rami said quietly. "It's my sister's light. It'll lead me back to her." Elias said nothing, but his expression softened ever so slightly. Outside, the sea crashed against the rocks, its relentless rhythm a reminder of the peril that lay ahead. Yet, in the flickering firelight, Rami's determination burned brighter than ever. The waves thundered against the cliffside, their echoes filling the stillness of the hut. Morning brought no solace. The skies remained heavy with clouds, and the air carried a biting chill. Rami stood at the edge of the cliff, lantern in hand, staring out at the vast expanse of gray-blue water. Somewhere, beyond this endless stretch of sea, Layla was waiting for him. Inside the hut, Elias grumbled as he stirred a pot over the fire. "You won't find her, boy. This isn't a story where everyone gets a happy ending. She's out there," Rami said without turning. "I just have to follow the light." Elias snorted but didn't reply. He carried his bitterness like an anchor, dragging it everywhere. Rami didn't understand it yet, but he could see the weight of loss etched into every line of the old man's face. That afternoon, Elias took Rami along the shoreline to search for food. They trudged across the rocky beach, eyes scanning the tide pools for anything edible. Rami's stomach growled at the sight of crabs scuttling beneath the water, but Elias caught only one. "It'll do," Elias muttered, tucking the crab into a net. "We don't eat like kings out here." "Why do you stay on this island?" Rami asked. "Because the sea doesn't take me," Elias replied, his voice low and bitter. "Not for lack of trying." Before Rami could ask more, Elias stopped abruptly, his sharp eyes fixed on the horizon. "We're not alone," he whispered, his hand tightening around the net. Rami followed his gaze. In the distance, a small boat bobbed toward the island. It carried 3 men, their faces hard and unreadable. "Traffickers," Elias muttered, his tone filled with venom. "They're searching for people like you." Rami's heart clenched. "We have to hide." Elias grabbed Rami's arm and dragged him toward the cliffs. They scrambled up the jagged rocks, their breaths coming fast and ragged. The wind whipped around them as they reached a narrow ledge hidden by overhanging boulders. "Stay quiet," Elias hissed, crouching low. The traffickers landed on the shore, their voices carrying over the wind. "They couldn't have gone far," one shouted. Another slammed a fist into his palm. "The boss wants every runaway back." Rami's grip on the lantern tightened. He wanted to run, but Elias placed a firm hand on his shoulder, rooting him in place. Hours passed as they waited, the traffickers' voices growing fainter. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias finally stood. "We need to move. They'll come back." "Where will we go?" Rami asked. "There's an old cave system inland. It's dangerous, but they won't follow us there." The trek to the caves was treacherous. The path twisted through dense underbrush, the ground slippery from the previous night's storm. Rami stumbled often, but Elias was always there to haul him back to his feet. When they reached the caves, the entrance loomed like a gaping mouth. Elias hesitated, his jaw clenched. "Stay close to me. These caves don't forgive mistakes." Inside, the air grew colder, the darkness pressing in on them. Elias lit a small torch, its flickering flame casting long shadows over the walls. "Why are we here?" Rami whispered, his voice trembling. "To survive," Elias said grimly. They ventured deeper into the labyrinth, the sound of dripping water echoing around them. Rami clung to the lantern, its broken glass catching the torchlight. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of fear and exhaustion pressing down on him. As they rested in a small cavern, Elias finally spoke. "Your sister, what was she like?" "She's brave," Rami said, his voice soft. "She always took care of me. She said we'd be safe if we stayed together." Elias stared at the fire, his expression unreadable. "The sea takes the brave, too," he said quietly. "She's not gone," Rami said firmly. "She's waiting for me. I know it." Elias didn't respond, but something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of a memory. Their respite was short-lived. The sound of footsteps echoed through the caves, sharp and purposeful. The traffickers had found them. Elias doused the torch, plunging them into darkness. "Run!" he whispered. "But run!" Rami obeyed, clutching the lantern as he bolted through the narrow passageways. Behind him, the sound of shouts and scuffling filled the air. His chest burned as he ran, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The path twisted sharply, and Rami tripped, crashing to the ground. The lantern tumbled from his hands, its dull frame clanging against the stone. He scrambled to retrieve it, his fingers trembling. A shadow loomed over him. "There you are!" one of the traffickers sneered, reaching for him. Suddenly, Elias appeared, a sharp piece of rock in his hand. He swung it with all his might, driving the man back. "Go, boy!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. Rami hesitated, fear rooting him to the spot. "Listen to me!" Elias roared. "You can't stop now!" With tears streaming down his face, Rami turned and ran, the lantern clutched tightly to his chest. The last thing he heard was Elias's roar of defiance as the darkness swallowed them both. The cave's jagged walls seemed to close in around Rami as he ran, each breath tearing at his chest. The faint echoes of Elias's struggle behind him faded into the distance, replaced by the relentless sound of his own footfalls and the drip of water overhead. The lantern's broken frame jostled against his chest, its cold metal a stark reminder of why he couldn't stop. Layla was waiting. The labyrinth twisted endlessly, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward him, threatening to pull him into the darkness. Rami stumbled again, his knees scraping against the rough stone. He bit back a cry, his lips trembling as tears blurred his vision. He couldn't afford to be weak, not now. Suddenly, a faint glimmer of light flickered ahead. Rami froze, his heart pounding. Was it the traffickers, or had Elias somehow escaped? He crouched low, inching closer until the glow resolved into a small crack in the cave wall. Through it, the outside world beckoned, a pale moon hanging in the starless sky above a rugged slope. Rami squeezed through the gap, the sharp rocks tearing at his clothes. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but relief flooded his chest. He was out. The hillside was steep, littered with loose rocks and sparse patches of grass. Rami moved carefully, the lantern swinging at his side. Below him, the forest spread out like a dark sea, its trees whispering in the wind. Somewhere in that expanse, Layla was waiting. But the traffickers weren't far behind. Their angry shouts echoed faintly from the cave's entrance. Rami quickened his pace, his small frame darting between boulders as he descended. Every noise, every rustle of leaves, felt like a warning. As he reached the edge of the forest, the lantern's broken glass caught the moonlight, casting fragmented beams ahead of him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to guide his steps. He pressed forward, the forest's dense canopy swallowing him whole. The forest was alive with sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen creatures, the creak of swaying branches. Rami's breath came in shallow gasps as he pushed through the undergrowth, the lantern held out before him like a shield. He didn't know how long he had been walking when he heard it, a faint, rhythmic hum, like the distant rumble of engines. He froze, his ears straining. The hum grew louder, accompanied by the faint glow of headlights weaving through the trees. A vehicle. Rami's heart soared with hope. Perhaps it was help, someone who could take him to Layla. He broke into a run, his legs burning with effort as he raced toward the light. But as he drew closer, the hope in his chest withered. The vehicle, a rusted truck, was surrounded by men, the traffickers. Rami ducked behind a tree, his chest heaving as he watched the scene unfold. The men were talking loudly, their harsh voices cutting through the stillness. One of them held a map, tracing routes with his finger. "We'll check the refugee camp at dawn," the man said. "The girl's name is Layla. If she's there, we grab her." Rami's blood turned to ice. They know her name. He backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. But his foot caught on a root, and he stumbled, the lantern slipping from his grasp. It hit the ground with a dull clink, the noise slicing through the night like a scream. "Who's there?" one of the men shouted. Rami didn't wait to find out. He grabbed the lantern and bolted, weaving through the trees as shouts erupted behind him. The traffickers gave chase, their heavy footsteps crashing through the forest. Rami's lungs burned as he ran, the forest a blur of shadows and fleeting light. He could hear the traffickers gaining on him, their voices growing louder. Panic clawed at his throat, but he pushed it down, focusing on the faint beam of the lantern's light. The forest opened up suddenly, revealing a wide river cutting through the trees. The current was swift, its surface shimmering in the moonlight. Rami hesitated only for a moment before plunging in, the icy water dragging at his small frame. He clung to the lantern with one hand, using the other to paddle furiously. The current carried him downstream, away from the shouts of the traffickers, but it also carried him toward the unknown, the river's twists and turns obscured by darkness. When the current finally deposited him onto a muddy bank, Rami collapsed, his body trembling with exhaustion. The lantern lay beside him, its glass cracked but intact. He clutched it to his chest, his tears mixing with the cold mud on his face. He was alone. Elias was gone. The traffickers were closing in, and Layla felt farther away than ever. But even as despair threatened to consume him, a memory surfaced. Layla's voice, steady and strong. "Follow the light and you'll find me." Rami wiped his tears, his small hands trembling as he adjusted the lantern's broken frame. The faintest spark of light flickered within, a fragile reminder of hope. He stood, his legs weak but resolute, and began to walk. The dawn broke reluctantly, its pale light filtering through the forest's dense canopy. Rami trudged forward, his small frame battered but unyielding. The lantern hung from his hand, its dim light a fragile companion. Every step felt heavier than the last, but his resolve burned brighter than the sunrise. He had to find Layla. The forest thinned as Rami climbed a ridge, the sound of distant voices and commotion carrying on the wind. He crouched low, peering over the hilltop to see a sprawling refugee camp nestled in a valley below. Tents flapped in the morning breeze, and people moved with quiet urgency, their faces lined with exhaustion and guarded hope. Rami's heart leapt. This had to be it. Layla had to be here. But his joy was short-lived. Parked at the camp's edge was the trafficker's truck, its engine idling as two men unloaded supplies. Rami's stomach twisted. They had beaten him here. He slipped down the ridge, keeping to the shadows as he approached the camp. The voices grew louder, mingling with the cries of children and the murmur of adults. Rami scanned the crowd desperately, searching for Layla's familiar face. Suddenly, he heard it, a voice calling his name. "Rami!" He turned sharply, his heart pounding. There, on the far side of the camp, was Layla. Her face was streaked with dirt, her clothes worn and tattered, but her eyes sparkled with recognition. She broke into a run, weaving through the crowd, her arms outstretched. "Layla!" Rami cried, his voice cracking as he ran toward her. They collided in a fierce embrace, her arms wrapping tightly around him. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I followed the light," Rami said, clutching her tightly. "I told you I'd find you." Their reunion was short-lived. A shout rang out behind them, sharp and menacing. The traffickers had spotted them. "Get the girl!" one of them bellowed. Layla's grip on Rami tightened as fear flashed across her face. "Run, Rami!" she urged, pulling him toward the camp's perimeter. But the traffickers were faster. They barreled through the crowd, their shouts sending people scattering. Layla and Rami darted between tents, their breaths coming in frantic gasps. When they reached the edge of the camp, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Elias. His face was battered, his clothes torn, but his eyes burned with defiance. "Get behind me," he growled. Rami and Layla hesitated for only a moment before obeying. Elias squared his shoulders, gripping a length of broken wood like a weapon. "You want them?" he snarled at the traffickers. "You'll have to go through me." The confrontation was brutal. The traffickers lunged at Elias, their fists flying. He fought back fiercely, his weathered frame moving with surprising strength. But he was outnumbered, and the blows rained down relentlessly. "Elias!" Rami screamed, his voice breaking as he tried to run to the old man. Layla held him back, her tears streaming. "We can't. He's doing this for us." Elias glanced over his shoulder, his bloodied face twisting into a grim smile. "Go!" he roared. "Take the light and run!" The traffickers closed in, and Elias disappeared beneath their assault. Rami's chest heaved with sobs, but Layla pulled him away, her grip unyielding. Together they fled into the forest, the sounds of the struggle fading behind them. Hours later, they reached the safety of a nearby patrol station. The officers, shocked by their story, sent a team to the camp, but it was too late. The traffickers had vanished, and Elias's fate remained unknown. Rami sat in silence, clutching the lantern. Its glass was cracked, its light faint, but it still glowed. It was all they had left of Elias, the man who had given everything for their chance to escape. Days later, as they boarded a rescue ship bound for safer shores, Rami worked on the lantern. His small hands carefully replaced its broken parts, his determination unwavering. "What are you doing?" Layla asked softly, sitting beside him. "Fixing it," Rami said. "It's our light. It brought me to you. It saved us." Layla's eyes filled with tears as she placed her hand over his. "He saved us," she said. Rami nodded, his throat tight. "Then we'll keep the light alive for him." When the lantern finally flickered to life, its glow was warm and steady. Rami and Layla sat together, watching its light dance on the water as the ship carried them toward a new beginning. The Lantern of Hope was more than a tool for survival. It was a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between siblings. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to HeroKind Stories and leave a comment. How did Elias's sacrifice resonate with you? Your thoughts inspire us to create more tales of courage and hope.